Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Noura Razian. I'm the head of exhibitions here and the curator of the Phantom Limb exhibition. So thank you all for coming tonight. To open the show, I've invited Pio Abad to give a talk about his ongoing project, the collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders, a portion of which is upstairs that he's produced in collaboration with his wife, Frances Wadsworth Jones. So Pio's work is concerned with the social and political significance of things, and he usually works in a range of media, including textile, photography, and sculpture. And tonight he's going to be talking about the project as a whole, the whole kind of beginning of the project and where it's led him to today. And the collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders is a project that reproduces objects from the Marcos' lavish inventory of portraits, silverware, jewelry, and antiquities that they collected during their time in office. And the project, by making these objects visible, the project allows access to an inventory that has remained invisible and performs an act of historical accountability that remains elusive, as Pio puts it. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and I'll leave it to Pio. Thank you.
Is it working? Yeah. Good evening, and thank you all for coming. First of all, I really want to thank the whole team at Jameel Arts Center for inviting me to speak to you this evening, and for putting together such a timely and such a moving exhibition. It's a real honor to be part of it. And I also want to thank my collaborator and my wife, Frances, who's over there, without whose expertise the work that we are showing as part of Phantom Limb really would not have been possible. The work we are exhibiting upstairs is part of a much longer project that I started in 2011. Entitled The Collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders, the project examines the political and cultural legacy of the Filipino dictators Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, who ruled the country from 1965 to 1986. And examining this legacy through the collection of paintings, objects, and jewelry that they amassed during their plunderous regime. Jane Ryan and William Saunders were the false identities used by Imelda and Ferdinand to deposit $950,000 to 4 Swiss bank accounts at Credit Suisse in Zurich in 1968. It was also through this account and many others that followed that the couple purchased art and property, most significantly 40 Wall Street, which is now known as Trump Building, donated $1 million to each of Richard Nixon's presidential campaign, and transformed foreign aid to private wealth. By the time they left office, investigators estimated the Marcos' wealth at about $10 billion US. As this project has evolved, it's been a real privilege to share the work not just to a global audience, but more importantly, to members of the Philippine diaspora who are present here tonight. The Philippine presence in Dubai, in particular, has been determined by this history, as the large-scale export of Philippine labor in the Middle East rose exponentially during the regime. During the final decade of the Marcos dictatorship, the number of Filipinos seeking work abroad, particularly in the Middle East, rose from 36,000 in 1975 to 370,000 in 1985. Numbers that were necessary to keep the Philippine economy afloat through cheap exported labor and foreign remittance, while the Marcoses ransacked the Philippine treasury. In the 8 years that I've been working on this project, the deteriorating political situation, not just in the Philippines, but globally, has made things more urgent, but also more difficult. As the spaces to present this project outside the Philippines have multiplied over those years, the space to realize its aspirations within the Philippines seems to be decreasing. The strongman has made a return in Philippine politics in the form of Rodrigo Duterte, and considerable effort and expense are being made to create a fantastical version of the dictatorship and to ensure that the details of its abuses are completely forgotten. The collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders is an extensive and elaborate disavowal of violent political fantasies, laundered histories, and alternative facts. The project really began with this family photo, which was taken in 1986. The painting in the photo depicts Ferdinand Marcos as the mythical figure Malakas. According to Philippine mythology, Malakas, the strong, and Maganda, the beautiful, were the first Filipinos who entered the world fully formed when a magical bird splits a single stalk of bamboo in half, revealing the pair naked and cradled inside. These images of the couple were fed into the propaganda machine and proliferated as murals, paintings, and sculptures throughout the city. In assuming the personas of Malakas and Maganda, the Marcoses sought to mythologize and present themselves as a center of cultural and political renewal in the Philippines. The official slogan of the dictatorship was, "Make this nation great again." The image of the couple emerging nude from a bamboo stalk became the iconographic representation of the regime amidst its proclamations of post-colonial self-realization. An irony given that Marcos was largely enabled by Western democracies wary of the rising tide of communism in Southeast Asia. Fortunately, at least for one historical moment, Filipino agency overtook the political expediency of the West. On the 25th of February 1986, the Marcoses were forced out of office after 2 million Filipino civilians took to the streets in a nonviolent uprising known as the EDSA Revolution. This photograph was taken by my mother that evening, a few hours after Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos fled the palace and boarded one of Ronald Reagan's helicopters for a reluctant Honolulu exile. My mother and my father, the person happily posing in the photo, were part of the first wave of protesters to enter their private chambers. A few years before, they were both arrested and detained for their roles in establishing the social democratic movement that would eventually be crucial in toppling the dictatorship. They would later be involved in the country's difficult and increasingly disheartening transition to democracy after 20 years of authoritarian rule, a national project that currently seems in tatters. This photo is one of the earliest documentation of that exact moment when the public facade of Malakas and Maganda collapsed, and the people they'd been oppressing suddenly had access to the sordid private life behind these misrepresentations. The Marcos myth came at the cost of 3,240 lives, the torture of 34,000 more, and the systematic ransacking of the national treasury, one of the largest thefts in history that exploited the then nascent neoliberal system of offshore havens and shell companies. Shortly after the revolution, these portraits of Ferdinand Marcos as Malakas and Imelda Marcos as Maganda, made by an artist named Evan Casaico, were moved from the presidential bedrooms and placed on display at the Malacanang Palace Museum, where they remained on display for a number of years. However, when I visited in 2010, I was surprised to find that they were no longer available. So I decided that the best way for me to see them again was to get them remade. And this process of remembering through remaking then became central to this project. On the 18th of November 2016, the Philippine Supreme Court allowed for the corpse of Ferdinand Marcos to be buried in the National Heroes Cemetery, in a way completing the symbolic restitution that the Marcoses have sought since their temporary defeat. At that time, the Malakas and Maganda replica paintings were on display at the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design in Manila, and I asked that they be painted over, an intervention that seemed the only possible response, an act of protest and an act of despair. These events of the past few years have changed the photograph entirely, from an image of euphoric revolutionary victory to evidence of political failure. For all my parents' idealism and sacrifice, it is painful to confront the reality that the Marcoses and their adept mythologizing never really went away, that a blatantly corrupt regime once overwhelmingly rejected has gained absolution in such a short amount of time. A particular memory has been very important in trying to understand how this has happened. As a 6-year-old, my first memory of a museum was irrevocably tied to the fall of the regime. For a number of years after the revolution, the basement of the Malacanang Palace was turned into a provisional museum, a hastily constructed display of personal effects that has become a post-revolutionary trope in freshly liberated autocracies. I vividly remember walking through rows and rows of mahogany shelves and tabletops, each one spilling over with things, clothing, ornaments, perfume bottles, and yes, those infamous pairs of shoes. Unfortunately, along with the fragile democracy came the failure to institutionalize these collective acts of remembering that these displays were meant to encourage. By 1990, the political compromises of the new government and the convenient shifts in allegiances by many of Marcos's cronies meant that by the time this museum was packed away, the clamor for an exhausted and disillusioned public for accountability seemed to have gone with it. 32 years later, no one from the regime, much less the family, has been persecuted, and accounts of its corruption and violence remain absent on school textbooks and historical curricula, making it too easy for collective memory to be transformed into partisan fictions. Reconstructing the collection has been a defined attempt to achieve some kind of accountability by insisting on the inventory as a strategy for transparency and resistance. The scale of the Marcos loot is so vast and so astonishing in range that it is often only referred to in collective terms: loot, plunder, ill-gotten wealth. So much so that over time, it is assumed in its status as a collective noun an almost abstract singularity, a single object then easier to disregard, to trivialize, or to contain within one of Imelda's high-heeled shoes. One of the main reasons behind this project was to disentangle this loot from that collective singularity, laying out individual objects almost forensically to confront the public with its unwieldy scale and its terrifying range. Although at that time when I was starting my research, what that scale and range meant really remained unclear. Initially, it was difficult to piece this collection together, as it has obviously never been made available to the public. What has been recovered of the so-called Marcos collection, a seemingly arbitrary assortment of old masters, silverware, and a large collection of Grandma Moses paintings, were sequestered by the government, some hidden away in storage, a few displayed in government offices, and most auctioned off. The solution to finding this invisible collection came about purely by chance. With me searching Imelda Marcos on Amazon.co.uk and coming across a Christie's catalog from 1991. On the 11th of January 1991, the Presidential Commission on Good Government, or the PCGG, which is the Philippine agency tasked with sequestering and liquidating the Marcos assets, auctioned off 78 Renaissance paintings from the Marcos collection for a total of what now seemed like quite a paltry $15.4 million. An early painting by the Italian master Raphael, which dates from 1503, sold for $1.65 million. El Greco's Coronation of the Virgin, painted in 1603, sold for $2.1 million. And Titian's Portrait of Giulio Romano, from about 1536, was bought for $1.1 million. Surprisingly, the bidders were undeterred by the disclaimer printed on every page of the catalog, stating that the Christie's warranty of authenticity did not apply to works executed before 1870. The images in these catalogs became the basis for the first presentation of the collection of Ryan and William Saunders in London in 2014. I showed it as an installation that assumed the classical guise of a European museum. The paintings digitally printed on canvas, varnished, and framed in gilt bamboo frames. A performance of first world civility amidst evidence of third world criminality. I was interested in anchoring the exhibition on the auction for a number of reasons. I mean, the most obvious one being that the catalog probably provided the most thorough visual accounting of the loot, that even the government agencies trying to investigate it were using it as the main form of reference. Another reason was the timing of the event itself, taking place in 1991 between two defining, if unfortunate, episodes. A few months prior to the auction, Imelda was indicted by the federal court in New York City for fraud and racketeering charges. Her tearful performance as a naive widow during the trial was sensational. She presented herself as nothing more than a well-loved wife, lavished with expensive presents by a devoted husband. And she repeatedly broke down in tears as the prosecution presented mounting evidence of bank transactions and shell companies that allowed her to use the Philippine treasury as a personal piggy bank. At one point, Imelda collapsed in the middle of the trial and was later strapped to a portable blood pressure monitor, which would gurgle loudly every time her blood pressure rose. Unfortunately, Imelda's performance also proved convincing. After a 4-month trial, Imelda Marcos was acquitted of all charges. True to form, American expediency found a way to aid Philippine impunity. the jury decided that the late Ferdinand Marcos looted the Philippine treasury without the explicit knowledge of his wife, despite her previous roles as Minister of Human Settlements and Governor of Manila. Immediately after the verdict, Imelda headed to St. Patrick's Cathedral and proceeded to creep down the entire aisle to the altar on her knees. And after this acquittal, there were no longer any legal impediments to bar Imelda's return to the Philippines. On the 4th of November 1991, an unrepentant Imelda returned home along with 2 of her children. More recently, the 2016 presidential elections that saw the rise of Rodrigo Duterte saw the near victory of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. as vice president. And an even more recent election saw the daughter Aimee win as Philippine senator. Viewed in the context of these events, the auction, by dispersing the Marcos collection and recirculating it back into the market, also served to launder these items, silencing the historical narrative they are tainted with. When I first presented the project at the Jorge V. Vargas Museum in Manila that same year, the paintings from Imelda's sequestered collection reappeared not as cheap replicas, but printed as postcards laid out on a 10-meter-long white plinth, spanning the length of the gallery. The idea was to present an installation in an almost forensic fashion, a monumental body of evidence neatly arranged for scrutiny. For most, if not all of the audience, this served as their first encounter with these objects that have long been reduced to an abstraction. On the back of each postcard are various found texts, each painting bearing witness to these fraudulent acts, and in the process, implicating an expansive network of players from the worlds of art and politics. The public was invited to take ownership of the artworks and take as many postcards as they want, and some of them really took advantage of that. An act of restitution is performed repeatedly as they create their own personal collection of paintings from the postcard reproductions, returning the collection to the rightful owners who unknowingly purchased the works but never really enjoyed its visual benefits. The third part of this project, a part of which is shown upstairs, concerns the jewelry seized by the US Customs from the Marcoses at Honolulu Airport when they sought exile in 1986. This collection is appropriately referred to in court documents as a Hawaii collection. Shortly after their seizure, the collection was turned over to the Presidential Commission on Good Government. And for 3 decades, the jewelry of language in the vaults of the central bank, hidden from public view amidst legal challenges from the Marcos family. In February 2016, the PCGG announced that all legal impediments have been cleared for the pieces to go to auction, with a planned public exhibition to precede the sale. Along with planning the exhibition, they also valued Imelda's jewelry in terms of the specific costs of national development it would have financed. I was in initial discussions with the PCGG at that time to find a way of collaborating on some kind of presentation when the victory of Duterte in May 2016 put a stop to these plans. His administration announced plans to begin dismantling the PCGG, with its responsibilities being transferred to the Office of the Solicitor General, a position currently held by a Marcos loyalist. Not knowing what to do with these high-resolution images of the jewelry shared by the PCGG, and fully aware of the implications of showing photographs that were not mine, I began a collaboration with my wife, Frances, who also happens to be a jewelry designer adept at 3D modeling, which has been a really amazing skill to have. And I think working with her has made it clear even more that the role of family has always been central to this project. And in this instance, this role shifts from being an archive to being an agent. From these single images gathered, Frances created complex 3D renderings of each piece of jewelry, which were then printed in resin, a project that took over 2 years to complete, and one that involved a certain level of speculation, as our only point of reference for each piece was one image. We first exhibited these works as part of the Honolulu Biennial earlier this year, completing a journey that returns the jewelry to the scene of the Marcos family's temporary defeat. However, these pieces arrived in Hawaii and now in Dubai, not as luxurious accessories, but as spectral reconstructions with a different story to tell. Among them, a 19th century Belle Epoque diamond tiara in platinum with a Cartier central diamond that can fund the treatment of 12,052 cases of tuberculosis until their full recovery. An antique Ceylon sapphire and diamond necklace mounted in silver and gold by Van Cleef in Arpels that can provide electricity to approximately 2,252 households in off-grid areas. An antique intense pink Taviz-cut Golconda diamond worth the combined construction of Bicol International Airport and the renovation of Sanga-Sanga Airport in Tawi-Tawi. One of the people who attended the opening in Honolulu was an American lawyer named Sherry Broda. Sherry was one of the lead attorneys fighting to collect damages for the victims tortured and killed during the Marcos dictatorship. This civil suit marked the first time a case was tried in a US court claiming human rights violations in another country. In 1995, the case was ruled in favor of the victims of the Marcoses, and the Marcoses were ordered to pay over $2 billion in compensation, payments that they are still fighting to collect from the Marcos estate and their hidden assets. Also, on the day that the show opened in Honolulu, the Duterte government announced that they are once again considering auctioning the Hawaii collection on the proviso that Imelda Marcos herself can be invited to bid. The biggest challenge of this project has been the fact that it is addressing an unfolding narrative, a history under constant siege that can leave you oscillating between despairing that the possibility of democracy in the Philippines is another fantasy and being bolstered by those who continue to negotiate a space for it in the direst of circumstances. When I presented the project in San Francisco last June, the jewelry was transformed even further. I started thinking about the work not just in the context of it being a body of evidence, but also as an effigy for all of those bodies that have suffered at the hands not just of the Marcoses, but of the political dispensations that have followed it. Enlarged to the scale of the body and cast in concrete, the jewelry is transformed into something even more incontrovertible, a monument, or more appropriately, a mausoleum. I want to end in the beginning. I started the project with my mother's gaze, and after her death 2 years ago, an anniversary that we in fact commemorated yesterday, in some ways, it's her loss that has defined the work since. It wasn't coincidental that my mother died as the country that she sought to create fell into pieces. An entire nation's social cancer became her own. In the 8 years that I've been working on this project, the collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders has evolved in unexpected, sometimes unwelcome ways. Most significantly, it has become not just an exhaustive attempt at seeking reparation, but also an exhausting but necessary process of grieving. Thank you. Drink my water now.
I'll invite you all to ask a few questions and then to move up to see the actual work in the exhibition along with the other artists, some of which are present here tonight. So if anyone has a question, we'll take a few.
Hi, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
You talked about looking at the project as a body of evidence.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was reminded of was, apart from using public revenue or taxpayer money to support their lavish lifestyle, the Marcos family, and particularly Imelda Marcos, was known for using public funds to construct these ridiculously grand buildings. Now, I know this might be slightly beyond the scope of this particular project, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I was wondering, have you thought about sort of incorporating ideas and thoughts from that area into your work? Because that's such an important part of their story.
I think actually it does. I mean, it's amazing how much scope this project has, and I've chosen to present certain selections of it. Otherwise, I could be here for 2 hours, and no one gets to see the work. But yeah, I think that the role of the Marcoses in building infrastructure, particularly cultural infrastructure, has been also one of the reasons why they have managed to stay in power, because there's this underlying of culture of patronage. Marianne Pastorosas is here, who's actually lived through that history, where their patronage of culture through these infrastructure, through these buildings, has rendered certain aspects of Philippine art, Philippine contemporary art, complicit in silencing these narratives. And so it is very much very much the foundations, it's very funny, of this project. In particular, they built this, which arguably is still one of the most beautiful buildings in Manila, the cultural center of the Philippines. This beautiful brutalist structure, which became the house of Philippine experimental art, and a lot of conceptual artists in the Philippines who were taught by one of the founding directors of this institution are the ones active now. So even as a conceptual gesture, it really set the ground for talking about these things.
So where's the project going next? Is it done, or are you still working on it?
I always say it's done, but it never is. It's going to Tokyo next, interestingly, and then in 2021, I'm working towards bringing the whole project, the whole 8-year project, back to Manila. There's a museum called the Ateneo Art Gallery, which is a university museum, and this place is of particular resonance because it was in this university that my parents were incarcerated. So it kind of brings the project full circle in a way. And it's important. And then hopefully that show can travel, but it's important that this comprehensive accounting of this project starts there.
Thank you for what you presented. Is this your first time exhibiting in a country that relies heavily on labor from the Philippines? That's one question. And another aspect of the same question is how, as an artist coming into a place that is not, where the Philippines is quite present, maybe how do you perceive that landing here and exhibiting here?
I think it's talking to even just to the Filipino staff here at Jamil. I think for them they were really happy that there is Filipino presence in an institution like this, and I'm more than happy to provide that representation. But also there's always some trepidation because whenever you go deal with the Philippine diaspora, there are a lot of contrasting political opinions. And I can only speak for myself. I can only talk about my own struggles. And I'm sure there will be, the Philippine consulate is here, like I'm sure they're having to negotiate a lot of conflicting conversations. And like I said, there is a forensic element to the work, and what I invite the viewer to do, whatever they believe in, is to look at the work which has facts laid out for it, and then to synthesize what they want to synthesize from it. But I can only speak strongly from my own experience of the disappointments of Philippine politics.
Hi, thank you very much for showing that relation between politics and art. I find it very interesting. My question would be, what's your goal through this artwork, especially in the world now with Duterte heading? I mean, I love the contrast you're talking about, and especially thank you for sharing your personal part of it. It gives you a lot of beautiful context. So going forward now, what's your aim, and given the current political status in the Philippines?
The aim is just to stage the inventory. I think I was, having spent some time, a few days here in Dubai, and actually talking to artists, like there's a lot, especially in this exhibition. There's so many shared concerns about, reconstruction and how that can aid memory, how that can aid talking about ideas of nation. I think the aim is to have an audience for it. I mean, that sounds really simple, but like you said, it can never solve the history it talks about, and all it can do is present something that will hopefully inspire a more direct political action, but it is still an act of representing. It's not politics, it's political art, right?
On that note, I'll invite everyone to move up to the exhibition space. And at 7 p.m., there'll be a short welcome note there in the presence of the other artists in the exhibition. So thank you, Pio.
Thank you very much. Thank you.